86.9 million people, those were the number of App Store impressions we had in the journaling app, Keo, that I had co-founded with my brother-in-law a few years back. Probably the most recent memory of that number is me sitting in a co-working space in Toronto, Canada, a laptop open, that Apple dashboard in front of my eyes, and I'm sitting there by myself and I'm looking at that number, and my next step is to hit delete from App Store. And talk about questions, like that's where for me all the wrong questions started showing up. Like, how could we fail at such a colossal level? Like, how do you reach that many people and we have to delete the app? And essentially the business we had created, ultimately it failed, and we couldn't keep going down that path.
Welcome to the Happy Engineer podcast, the place where we help engineers like you to build your career, balance your life, and be happy. I'm Zach White, former engineer turned lifestyle engineering coach, and your host for the journey to the career and life that you desire. Hey, I believe that you shouldn't have to sacrifice your life to reach your full potential at work. And what we're going to bring you in these conversations and interviews are the strategies, the tools, and the mindsets that are going to allow you to experience both success at work and success at home. Hey, we do the best we can to keep this free from advertisements. Of course, I can't control what YouTube may throw up, but do us a favor and share this podcast with anybody who you think may like it. And don't forget to click the bell and subscribe and get notifications to our YouTube channel and for upcoming releases of the Happy Engineer podcast. I would love your feedback, and even more than that, love your story. Share with us how these strategies and tools are working for you. Would love to be in touch with you. Connect with us on social media. Find me at Oasis of Courage on Instagram, Facebook, or Zach White on LinkedIn. It's an absolute pleasure to serve you. Now let's do this. Welcome back, happy engineers. It is so good to be with you. I am with Marc Champagne. What a pleasure. You just heard about him in the intro, and the bio could probably go on for days with everything going on with this man. But Marc, thank you so much for making time to be with me and the engineers out there listening today.
The pleasure is mine. I'm pumped to have this chat with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Marc, I want to start in a rather obscure place with a number. The number 86,997,014. And that number has a place of significance in your story. Would you just take us to that moment where that became relevant for you? What was going on in your world and what changed at that moment?
Yeah, you had to remind me of that number, did you?
I'm sorry, man.
No, it's all good.
I had to.
It's interesting because that number, first of all, that 86.9 million people, those were the number of App Store impressions we had in the journaling app, Keo, that I had co-founded with my brother-in-law a few years back. I have a bit of a mixed relationship with that number because on one hand, I'm incredibly proud of reaching that many people with a team of, really 5 people, let's say, without any type of extended contractors, but team of 5 people, a team that really had no experience or business being in app development. We had a vision, we had a goal of helping as many people as possible in the wellness space. And in this particular situation, reflection through questions. And, I think the other thing was just showing that anything is possible. Like, the possibility exists for all of us. We had no idea that we'd be featured by Apple, like hundreds of countries around the world, which generated a lot of those App Store impressions. So, there's an element of gratitude there that we did it and we stuck to our own strategy. We put the best work we could out there to do that. And it seemed to pay off with views and whatnot. But then on the flip side, probably the most recent memory of that number is me sitting in a co-working space in Toronto, Canada, my laptop open, that Apple dashboard in front of my eyes, and I'm sitting there by myself. The team was scattered around the world, essentially doing their own thing at that point. And I'm looking at that number, and my next step is to hit delete from App Store. And talk about questions. Like, that's where, for me, all the wrong questions started showing up. Like, how could we fail at such a colossal level? Like, how do you reach that many people and we have to delete the app and essentially the business we had created for a number of reasons, but ultimately financially it failed, and mentally we couldn't keep going down that path. Thinking, what would my family think? What would my ex-colleagues think? I left a really well-paying, secure job in the corporate world for 10 plus years to pursue this idea. And I remember when I was informing my team that, say, hey, I have this idea that I don't want to regret not doing, because I was happy in my job. It wasn't one of those scenarios of, dreading going in.
Yeah.
Thinking of them, like, I remember them looking at me thinking, yeah, I have an idea like that too. Like, you're almost like, they didn't say this, but almost you could see it in their eyes. Like, you're so courageous to go and do this. Right. And now I'm deleting this thing, like, what would I say now to those people? That was a really dark period in my life, but it's who I am now. It's why we're even speaking right now, why we're able to connect. So I'm ultimately very grateful for that number, that business, and the fact that it's put me on the path that I'm on right now.
Marc, I can only imagine the weight of that moment prior to clicking. Can you just describe before you clicked delete and the moment immediately after? What was that like?
Oh, I mean, there was the weight of the judgment, the self-judgment on myself, but also just forecasting what others would think. But then there was also the weight of the fact that we had users of this app. This isn't just another email subscription app or productivity software or something like that. We had messages coming in from new moms saying, hey, I've recorded all the photos and thoughts of like my firstborn type thing. And like people were journaling and reflecting. So there was a big weight there as well, from the perspective of giving every possible solution to those users to export their data, because we didn't have that feature. That was next in the roadmap. So we actually took a month to hack something together. All the engineers listening, if you're working on apps, you'd be really disappointed in what we put together, but at least we were able to export data and people could have that data. So we were proud about that. But the feeling after was just this emptiness and this feeling of loneliness, even though I was in a share space and there were other people around and they were essentially strangers and they weren't the team that I was building this with. So from a team perspective, I was essentially by myself. And probably the biggest emotion was just fear of now what? And for the first time in my life, not having a really clear plan forward. I came out of that corporate world. When I left that, had a very clear plan on what we wanted to do with this app and business. The app was just one part of that plan. Like, we really wanted to create this wellness organization and help as many people as possible. Everything was in that plan. My identity, my visions for the future, all of it. And within a click, it was gone. Right. And
wow,
that journey taught me, though, that when it comes to mental fitness, which is what I do now, what I've been writing about and what that app was all about, that was the space that I wanted to continue in. But I just deleted my method to staying into that. I didn't have another option at that point. And I didn't want to go back to that past industry because it just didn't feel like that was the type of work that really lit me up, having experienced this. So it was, a bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but I mean, all of that was stewing in my mind at incredible speed, basically leading to the same thing of feeling hopeless, terrified, and not knowing what to do next.
For the engineer listening to this, I don't want you to get lost on the idea of like, this is big and far away. Like what Marc's sharing, I know that there's a part of your story where you can relate to fear and loneliness and asking that question, now what, in your world. And keep listening, because Marc has taken that moment and turned it into something really beautiful. And I can't wait to get into this. But within a click, it was gone. Boom, here we are. Like all of that identity, all of who you were up to that point, this huge, courageous action to go build this business. And by the way, for anybody who has not attempted to go connect with 90 million people around the planet in your own business with a team of 5, it is not a small accomplishment. Like this, that is a significant outcome. And just acknowledge you, Mark, for really doing something extraordinary in those years that you built the app. Tell us then, where did the journey go? I know we could spend all day in the details, but from that moment of emptiness and loneliness, bring us forward to how you fell in love with questions and the work that you're doing now in mental fitness.
After deleting the app, there was probably a good 2 to 4 weeks of just probably the closest I've ever been. And maybe I was flat in a full-on depression. And I remember thinking, okay, so this is how easy you can slip into this stuff if you're not really focusing on your mental health and your mental fitness, because I knew I was neglecting my own practices. I was basically paralyzed by fear. And it was only just reflecting back through the journey with that app and all of the people that I was fortunate enough to have interviewed for the content of the app and their practices, which included engineers like Kevin Rose, and there was a ton of technical experts in the app that were sharing their practices that you wouldn't think had these things, right? Like Kevin Rose was really big on with meditation and journaling and reflection and trying to still his mind, for example. So I slowly started remembering those conversations and started to get back into my own practices, which allowed me to drop into the present moment as much as possible, so that those looping thoughts and those anxious thoughts, let's say, and emotions and whatnot that we all have on a day-to-day basis, these were just heightened. It was like I poured gasoline on those thoughts given the situation. So I was feeling everything, but they were there. And I knew enough from the practices that if I can just tap into the present moment and the fact that, yeah, you know what, I just deleted this app, but I deleted it on a laptop that most people in the world don't have, and be grateful for the fact that, oh yeah, I'm in a co-working space where there aren't bombs being dropped on this building, or I'm not fearing my safety in some capacity. I can go get a glass of water out of this space. Like those were the thoughts right back to the basics that were allowing me to pause that internal narrative so that I could think, because I knew enough that I could come up with a plan, but I need to think clearly to do that. Just like anyone listening, with like, this is an extreme situation, but I've used this and I've learned this from others. It's not like I'm making this up, but even with problems in our day-to-day work, it's really hard to get to a solution or see past the current obstacle when your mind is fogged with other thoughts and emotions. So for me, the first step is to really get clear and blow out the mental fog. And one way that I do this, and is the backbone of my work, is through questions, because the questions are a universal language that we all speak. We all ask questions. What do I want to work on? Where do I want to live? Who do I want to be with? Like, what's my next move? So we're asking the questions, but are we asking the best questions, and are they well timed for the situation that we're in right now? There's certain questions I could have asked myself in that moment, like, how could we have failed? Or why did we fail? But that wasn't going to get me out of the rut that I was digging, essentially.
Right.
The question that pulled me out of that was, what do I want for my life? And that's a pretty high, grandiose question. But if you can start at something like that, then it leads to the next question. Okay, well, if I want this, right, then this, and then you keep going. And all it does is it pauses that narrative again, right? And allows you to make a plan and take those micro steps to getting you forward.
There's a lot here, and I want to keep chasing the question piece, but I got to back up for 1 second, Mark, because you've been using the word practices. There's something about that. I want to make sure that the listener and I are really with you. When you say practices, what do you mean, and why do we use that word instead of something else? There's just something about, I can sense some intentionality behind you.
Sure.
And especially when you mention it's so easy to even neglect my own practices. Just tell us a little bit more about why practices, and This neglect, the habits, dig into that for me a little bit.
I mean, you can use practices or you can interchange that word with rituals as well. I like practices because to practice something, it means that you're practicing it. So it removes the idea of you have to be perfect at this thing and that you're evolving with whatever that is. Now, I think the most important thing, and this is why we started the journaling app in the first place, was to show that I'm not just talking about meditation, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think there's a lot of stereotypes out there that, especially back 5 years ago, and especially journaling, that the people that were doing these type of practices were going on these long silent retreats or, sitting on the top of a mountain in a robe meditating, which again, there's nothing wrong with that. But if anyone sees the video or whatnot, that's not me. I'm not doing those things. I'm just a regular guy that was going in at the time, working in the healthcare space, crunching numbers as an analyst at one point, looking at spreadsheets and figuring out how these practices could help keep my mind focused and primed and clear. What I had lost in that time when the fear set in was the morning practices, essentially, just getting up a little bit earlier than most. And it doesn't have to be anything crazy. It could just be as my coffee's brewing or your tea's brewing or whatever you're doing in the morning. Most of us have some sort of routine to it, taking that routine and adding a little bit more intentionality to it. So I would take 2-3 minutes while my coffee's brewing and just think about how I want to feel that day. One word, I want to feel motivated. Just doing that, which takes seconds, primes your mind to look for that motivation throughout the day. You've already won a certain part of your day by just doing that one small thing. Because we all know life's going to happen. Things are going to come up. We're going to get rocked. Our emotions are going to be charged by something someone said, or we're not going to be able to figure something out. But we've already primed our mind to look for motivation cues.
Yes.
So it's something as small as that. And then you start practice stacking on top of that. You add something else, or you do that, in the middle of the day where, you know what, I'm going to take 5 minutes, just take a walk. I'm not going to jam a podcast in and an audiobook. I'm just going to walk, be still, quiet the mind, release that, come back to whatever I'm working on, and then you crush it. Typically.
Yes. And I want to highlight what you're saying, because I'm with you that we tend to bucket practices of mental fitness or mental health into a couple of major categories: journaling, meditation, and we make them big, complex, and demanding of a significant investment of time and energy. And I hear you saying, Mark, it can be simple, it can be short, and it can be very diverse. Like, there are lots of ways to bring these practices to life that may work for you. It's not narrow in terms of how this looks in your life as an engineer. And I think that's huge. It creates some freedom to look at this through a different and broader lens.
Well, and it gives you the pause. The magic is in this pause that most of us, and I'm guilty of this as well, because I'm operating in the same society as everyone listening. And our society is not set up for the pause. It's set up for productivity and just work as fast as possible and get as much done. Whereas the pause allows for a question like, or a question can stimulate this pause, like, does this make sense? I remember that was probably the most significant question I would ask myself, especially when crunching numbers and like looking at these $100 million forecasts. What I just set up mathematically, all these sheets, the software, does this make sense? And can you cross triangulate that with a few different things? And you can use a question like that for really anything in your life. But if you don't ask the question, then all of a sudden you're at the end of the process and maybe it doesn't make sense. And now you're really trying to figure out a serious situation, right?
So now we connect the dots here. You're recovering from a period of dark, challenging mental state, emotional state that was just rocked, and questions and digging back into these practices started to help you spiral upward again. Tell us about, how do questions lead to the meaningful change that you've ultimately experienced and are now helping so many other people to experience?
It was out of necessity for my situation. as I mentioned, when I lost all of that hope and the optimism and the drive and didn't feel like I had a plan, what was able to reverse that and then bring back hope and excitement was that question of what do I want for my life? And then spending a few minutes writing those things out. And then, okay, well, if that's what I want, what do I need to do to start getting there and make the steps and take the actions? And I revisited a lot of the podcast interviews and written interviews that we had conducted for the app. And I was collecting the questions from all these people, right? And the realization that I made was we're always at any point one question away from a completely different life. Had I not asked that question, I don't know where I would be. I'd probably spiraling down and hopefully, I would have gotten a lifeline of another question to, again, pause that narrative and pull me out. But we're all one question away from a different life, or in a business setting, a completely different outcome. So that's what started spinning my mind around, well, that's super simple, but yet super hard at the same time, because
Yes.
like I said, there's so many questions you can be asking. And if that question for me of, well, what do I want for my life landed at a different time, it just wouldn't have been relevant for me or practical.
You mentioned the pause. I can't think
Yeah.
of a more important statement to pause on than what you just said. This is huge. So engineer, listen up. You're one question away from a completely different life. What does it take, Mark, to really believe that? If somebody's hearing that and they're like, okay, that's interesting. How do you actually test? Like, do I believe that's true? Do you have to experience it yourself? Or like, how can we help the engineer listening realize what you're saying? It's not just philosophical mumbo jumbo. Like, this is for real. How do you deepen your conviction around what you're saying?
Well, I would take one sheet of paper, draw a line down the middle, and on one side write, my ideal life looks like this, and list out how you want to live and what you want to do, the type of people you want in your life. And then on the other side of the paper, what does my current day in life look like? And you know what? There might be a really nice synergy there, which is great, but typically there isn't, myself included. But that one question of pausing to look at the autopilot of your life and what's going on in the work that you're doing, to comparing what you want and seeing if there's a disconnect there, then you have a decision. Now you have data, you have insight. Yes. And it's up to you there. I mean, that the next step is on all of us individually, whether we want to take that data or insight and do something about it, but at least we have it, right? So that's one thing, probably one of the hardest questions to answer if you're not in the state that you want to be is, am I happy? Yes, no. If it's a no, that's a scary thing. So now because if you answer no and you ignore that, now you're pretending to not know something, right? And that's another question that I'll never forget. I interviewed this guy named Jamie Wheel from the Flow Research Collective, working on flow states and whatnot with Stephen Kotler. Really awesome work. And the question he left with me was, what am I pretending not to know? And I remember I kicked back my chair and I looked up in reflection, because I immediately thought, well, for me personally, I'm pretending that I can out exercise a bad diet, like for a decade, probably. That's a real, I'd say, a popular one for most people listening, at least in America. You can think of the relationships in your life. Are there certain relationships that you're pretending are not toxic, but they are? Right. And again, they could have been useful and served a purpose down the road, but you can release those things. Are you pretending that you're doing work that lights you up, but doesn't? Now, I sound a bit glib here because I'm just trying to show you the comparison, but this is what I mean with this type of work, is that I think the reason why it's so hard is because it is hard to answer those questions.
Right.
Right.
I feel myself in this conversation, even what you just asked, what am I pretending not to know, inspired to just start exploring that with you. And it's opening up new areas, shining an awareness in my mind to things that I would not have seen if you hadn't asked that question. And it leads into the work of what you're saying and doing now with Personal Socrates and the book and everything that is happening in your world. And so I think it's literally happening in this conversation, but can we just get a baseline really quick? I mean, we're talking to engineers. They love to geek out on things. What is the Socratic method? What are we applying here when we're talking about questions?
There's a bit of a backstory with the title of the book, because I remember speaking with the publisher, who the CEO of that company was actually a good friend, someone that I had met during the app days, because I was looking for a printer to be able to eventually export people's journals if they wanted to do that as a feature. So that's how I met. And long story short, they ended up publishing the book. But I was explaining the process that I was going through about asking this question, and then a good question leads to another question. He's like, "Oh yeah, the Socratic method." And I, I remember thinking, I'm like, yeah, you're right, but that's as far as my knowledge goes. Like, yeah, I've heard of this dude Socrates, like most of us, and that's probably as far as it goes. Or Socrates asked questions. So I actually hated the title of the book at first, because I'm like, this sounds bizarre. I'm not trying to write a book on philosophy. And it wasn't until we got the combination of the main title, Personal Socrates, and the subtitle, Questions That Will Upgrade Your Life from Legends and World-Class Performers, that I'm like, that clicks. That makes sense. That's what I've been studying. And as it turns out, when I started doing the research into Socrates and the Socratic method, it just blew my mind that this method has been around for so long, almost the beginning of time, essentially. But it seems to only be discussed in an academic setting. And it's, Socrates asking his students to question the question, and then question their response, and keep asking questions until essentially you get past the surface level. Essentially, that's what we're doing. So I wanted to set out to take that method, because clearly it's been proven to work. It's not like it's gone away, but how can we make it digestible and applicable in our modern day life?
Yeah.
And so I pared it down into something that's a little bit more memorable, I think, to pull up in regular thinking. And that is just in 3 sections, which is how the book sections work their way through the process. And then that is to start with getting clear. Then when you're clear, and again, this can work. We've been talking a lot about our personal lives, but this stuff works in your work, obviously, in your relationships, everything. Getting clear. And then once you're clear, then you can start designing your work and your life with intention and priming your mind to do that. There's practices and rituals to do that, and questions as well. And then ultimately, when you're doing those 2 things, then all of a sudden you start seeing things that you probably haven't seen before. And that's when this whole idea of living in an expanded world or in a place of opportunity starts showing up. It's because you can see it. Just like you can cram on a problem behind your computer screen for 12 hours, but if you take a walk or take the shower where the ideas come out, well, what do you think's happening in the shower? You've given the space to clear your mind. There's no surprise that we get ideas when we're on a run or we're taking a shower. So the idea of the book is to provide the prompts through profiles of people that I've either interviewed, or the legends of the past, like Picasso or Kobe Bryant, Stephen Hawking. He was fascinating to just dive into his thinking. The questions are inspired by those people, so that anyone jumping into the book, my hope is that no matter where you're at in your life, you'll either resonate with an individual or you'll resonate with their opening prompt. And that'll at least get you started in this type of work or this type of practice.
Mark, you alluded to something that triggered for me as an engineer, the idea that we associate Socrates with philosophy. And engineers, we pride ourselves on practical application of knowledge for real results in the world, right? Like, we're here to make a difference. So how would you describe approaching the Socratic method from the lens of an engineer rather than the lens of a philosopher?
So I mentioned Stephen Hawking. I mean, he comes to mind right away, because there you have a physicist, right? Like, based in science, obviously, and everything is numbers and equations. Part of what I wrote about in his profile was to remember Stephen Hawking when we're walking around looking down, when we can actually be looking up at the stars. Because I can't prove this, but most people know, obviously, Stephen Hawking was diagnosed with ALS at a really young age. pretty sure it was his early 20s, basically right when he was getting going in his career. But I really think his curiosity and the idea of asking questions to understand what is out there. I want to know what is out there and try to figure this out and keep stimulating his mind. I really believe is what extended his life into the years that he lived. That disease at that time when he was diagnosed, I'm pretty sure the probability of living was under 5 years or something. Like it wasn't very long. So when I think of someone like Stephen Hawking, that is really based in the science and analytical and whatnot, that is all very important. But the questions of stimulating his mind to question and to wonder and to imagine what is possible, I think is what drives us and keeps us motivated with whatever work we're doing. Like imagine if Naveen Jain, a billionaire that's profiled in here as well, who's created a few different companies. Right now, he's working to eliminate chronic disease through microbiome testing. He has a company called Moon Express, which I believe is the first company or the only company licensed to land on the moon that's a private company.
Wow.
And again, he told me, here's a guy that gets a ton of data thrown his way for investments, for business decisions. And he says, I take it all in, but then I take 15 minutes, I shut the door, I close my eyes, and I imagine myself making that decision and what it feels like 6 months down the road. If something feels off in having made that decision and visualizing, okay, I made the decision, this is what's playing out, this is what's supposed to happen. If something feels off, I don't make the decision. On the surface, it looks like a smart business decision, looks like a smart move from the numbers. But he's like, I've saved millions of dollars by doing that. Next thing you know, 3 months down the road, that company or project blows up. And for whatever reason, he tapped into his intuition and his gut. So I think we have some really sophisticated systems running for us. We've got our mind, we have our intuition, our gut, all of that. Let's allow those things to work together. We're not the first people to do this. I think we just need to give ourselves the permission. If Stephen Hawking can do it, Naveen Jain can do it, just give ourselves the permission, right?
I hope that the engineer listening is convicted and convinced by that. And I can personally testify, this is not about sitting at the city gates with your peers and just talking. This is about real meaningful change in your life and creating an impact in the world around you. And you look at the legends and world-class performers that Marc has profiled in this book, Personal Socrates, and you'll see how it changed their lives and how it can change yours. And what you just shared is pure gold. I coach the exact same approach to my engineering clients who are seeking to make a tough decision. Maybe it's to leave their company for a new opportunity, or I have two different roles that I could move into, director of this, director of that. Which way should I go? And as engineers, we love those data-driven decisions. We want it to be obvious. This is the right path. But life doesn't always serve up obvious right and wrong. It serves up A or B, and you have to choose which one. And that method you just described of sitting and putting yourself in the future, I do that same thing with my clients. And it's hard sometimes to trust ourselves in that intuition and to believe that what the subconscious is capable of is 100 times what our conscious mind can bring to the table. That's a random number. I'm sure it's probably even more than that, but truly awesome.
But that's where the clarity comes in too. Like that's where the consistent work in whatever mental fitness works for you, essentially the benefit or the outcome is this improved clarity, so that when you are faced with A and B, it becomes way more obvious which direction to go. Because just like publishing, when the offer was given to publish the book, there was no decision. It was a hell yes, because at that time I was either preparing it to pitch it to the regular Penguin and Crown, like put together the massive book proposals and go down that rabbit hole, or just self-publish. And in this case, it sits right in the middle. And the journey has been fantastic. I've loved every part of it. But there's no way I would have been a hell yes if I hadn't put in the work on the mental clarity side of things. If that question was posed even 6 months before, when I was coming out of that phase of my life where things were just jaded with fear and whatnot, it probably would have been a really agonizing decision that would have taken days, if not weeks, of weighing pros and cons and just not knowing what felt right.
That's so good. So Marc, man, I could go all day with you on this, but help us understand your life story now, you got back into the practices, you've been seeking clarity. Tell us, how is your life today after walking that journey for yourself?
I mean, in all transparency, the last 4 or 5 years have been the hardest years of my life when it comes to finances and bringing back some sort of level of security that I once had back in that life. My wife and I talk about it all the time, saying, we're different people having gone through this experience, and I wouldn't trade any of that in. And I'm still very much on this journey. The difference, though, is that I couldn't feel more aligned with the work that is being put out. I'm super excited about this book coming out to see how it does with people, if it resonates, and if it doesn't, how I can adjust. But I think the biggest thing is I'm excited. I'm excited and motivated about the process. I'm excited about some of the consulting work that I'm doing because of this when it comes to mental fitness, some of the speaking related to this at company. Like, it's all within this realm that 5-6 years ago, had you said, hey, you're going to be talking about questions and you're known as the question guy, and wrote a book called Personal Socrates, maybe my best friend who has a major in philosophy would have been like,
cool,
I don't,
man.
Yeah, cool. But other than that, that's about it. I'm excited to see where it all goes and doing my best to practice what I preach and just enjoy that journey, because I'm only ever going to get one experience with this first book. I can already feel that there'll be others and other projects, but not trying to figure out how to record an audiobook for the first time, dealing with cover designs and all these little nuances that come with putting this project out. I'm doing everything possible to just slow down myself and
cool.
Remember, right, that enjoy this. Like, this is where the magic is.
Yes, enjoy it. The magic is right in front of you. Marc, I love that. And I'll just say, to acknowledge and edify you on your journey, brother, the courage you had to start your business to reach those 90 million people was immense, but the courage to walk through the darkness and then to share your story in this way, I believe, is even greater, and awesome things ahead for you. I'm honored to have the question guy on our podcast, because Marc, the engineer listening wants to be happy. They want that fulfillment. They want that dream life, the ideal side of the page from the exercise you gave us earlier. And I believe engineering, like coaching in our lives, questions lead, answers follow. And so for that engineer who wants to be happy, Marc, what question would you lead them with today?
Well, we talked a lot about what do I want for my life. I think that's a great way to start, but I would say tap into the body and tap into that intuition and just ask what feels right. Don't overthink it. Just write exactly what comes to mind right off the cuff.
What feels right?
Yeah. What feels right now? Or what feels right in this situation or this decision? You can add detail around it, but just slowing down, pausing in the moment and asking yourself that question can go a long way.
I know a lot of engineers are going to be out of their comfort zone with that question. We don't always trust our feelings and our intuition. So I hope the listener takes you to heart on that and asks the question and spends some time with that. Marc, I know people are going to want to dig into the work you're doing to go further with this and get the book and get in touch with you and all this work around Personal Socrates and changing our lives through questions. Where can they get connected and find out what you're up to?
Well, thank you. And again, thank you for having me. This was fun. I can see we could speak for hours. The easiest place, everything directs from the website, behindthehuman.com, is where you can find me. That's also the title of the podcast. I'm accessible: LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, all the socials. Shoot me a message and let me know. Let me know a question that has really made a big impact in your life. I'd love to hear about it. I collect them. I have thousands of them at this point, just like some people collect baseball cards or other things. I collect questions. So please share those with me and tag me.
That's awesome. Well, we will put links to all the places you can find Marc and his book in the show notes at oasisofcourage.com. So go check that out. I've read the book. I love what's in there. I cannot recommend highly enough, engineers, you go out and get a copy of this for yourself. And it's not only
immersive and going to change you today, but it's a great thing to circle back to at various points in your journey when you feel stuck or frustrated or challenged at any point. There's just incredible value to the book and the work that Marc's doing. So Marc, again, I can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time and your story with us today. I hope we can do it again sometime, and I wish you a ton of success with the work you're doing. You're the question guy for sure. I love it. That's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hello, my friend. Zach White here again, and I wanted to let you know that's all we've got for this episode of the Happy Engineer podcast. Thank you so much for investing your time with me today. It is an absolute pleasure to be able to bring you this content. Just as a reminder, it would be amazing if you would subscribe and share this episode with any other engineers you know who may benefit from this. And if you're like me, I hope that you'll take some notes and, more importantly, take action. In our audio version of the podcast on Apple Podcasts and any place that you go to find podcasts, there's a little more content from me about this episode in the debrief. If you really want to hear about how to put this into action, I'd encourage you to go grab that. But thank you for joining us for the video version of our interview today. And again, can't thank you enough for helping us to get the word out about the Happy Engineer podcast and what we're doing. If there's any way we can serve you, would love to do that. Go find us at oasisofcourage.com or reach out to me on social media at Oasis of Courage. And don't forget again to subscribe and click the bell to have notifications of upcoming releases of new episodes of the podcast. As always, I want to leave you with this. If you stay in your comfort zone, you're not going to grow. So let's crush comfort, create courage, and let's do this.